On this edition of Independent Sources, a special look at President-elect Donald Trump and the next steps for his contentious presidency.
Independent Sources, your window to the city's ethnic and immigrant communities. Here's your host, Garry Pierre-Pierre.
President-elect Donald Trump has become even more of a lightning rod for criticism and controversy since his unexpected ascendancy to the post of commander-in-chief. Protests against his election have erupted in major cities around the country, and his appointments of Reince Priebus as his chief of staff and Stephen K. Bannon as his chief strategist and senior counselor are already stirring the ire of his detractors. Though his recent 60 Minutes interview saw him backpedal somewhat on his immigration stance, pundits are still questioning whether he is setting the tenor for his presidency with his appointments and asking what's next. With me in studio to talk about what could be next for the president-elect are freelance reporter Nida Khan and associate adjunct professor at CUNY, Dr. David Kuranga. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we started the show with you guys, and we're going to end it with you. So what's next?
Oh, God, such a loaded question. Honestly, I think we don't exactly know what's next. I think it's going to come down to who he surrounds himself by, which, as you just mentioned, we've seen Bannon, we've seen Priebus, right? So it's like those are two. One is Bannon to appease those people that voted for him, that believe in a lot of the things that most of us, or all of us, I should say, on this panel were really offended by those statements. And the other one is to appease the GOP establishment. Now it's going to come down to which way does he go, or which way, I should say, the majority of people that he surrounds himself by push him to go. Is it going to be the extreme right? Is it going to be, things like forced deportations? And are we going to see stuff like that in place, or are we going to see a more mainstream and a less Donald Trump and a more presidential Donald Trump, I should say?
Okay.
So I think it's going to come down to...
we've been looking for this presidential Donald Trump, David, for quite some time, and sometimes we get the glimpse of it, but most of the time we don't. What are we expect to see? We expect to see the real Donald Trump, as we've seen a year and a half?
I'm not even sure we know what that is, to tell you the truth. He hasn't really held public office in his life. We don't really know, I know where this is going to go. What we do know is that the office of the presidency has increased in power, unilateral power, over the last several decades. And once he swears in on the 20th, the law is on his side in a lot of ways. So some of the things that he said, whether or not he proceeds with them, the capacity to implement them will be in his hands. That is for sure. Where he goes, what's going to happen, and how that plays out, we don't know. We really have no way of knowing at this time.
Well, let's take the issue that really propelled his candidacy, his stance on immigration. Let's face it. To his credit, he has made immigration the cornerstone of this campaign, like we've never seen before. Of course, in a very to what some people will call racist and xenophobic stance. So he promised to deport 11 million people. On 60 Minutes recently, he said maybe 2 to 3 million criminals. First of all, are there 2 or 3 million criminals who are not here legally? And even that number, can you deport that many people?
Right. I don't know if it's, I said this, I remember when we were here last time, I don't know if it's actually economically possible, or I should say if he's able to get the funds to do that, because where is that money going to come from? In order for him to do something like that, to do the forced deportations of the 2 to 3 million. And that in and of itself, the 2 to 3 million is already backtracking on the 11 million or 12 million. It's always between 11 or 12. They say that there are undocumented folks here. So it's like he's already changing his stance on that. In that interview, he also, backpedaled on Obamacare, saying that he was going to leave, the 26-year-olds to stay on their parents' insurance, keep the pre-existing conditions so that people are not kicked off of their insurance for that or can obtain insurance. But then you look at something like the Muslim ban, it's back on the website. Went from the Muslim ban to banning people from certain countries to, it's always this constant flip-flopping. So that's why I say we don't know, because it could go any which way. And that's the scariest part, because are we going to be a country that does see, that sort of nationalistic, xenophobic, scary environment that has erupted that we've seen after he's been elected too? I mean, just look at the amount of hate crimes and things that have happened since then.
Okay. So, David, I know you don't want to talk about this, but those of us who have immigrants, parents, or friends and relatives, what should we tell them when they come to us asking us what's going to happen, what's going on?
Like I said, the power is in the hand. Once he takes office, the law is on his side. Their laws are, if you do not have proper documentation to be here, you're here illegally. He does not need any help from any Congress or anything. The law is on his side to remove these people. And also the instruments are on his side. He doesn't even need just the federal government. He can lean on the state governments, the state troopers, the local police, the local sheriffs. And they rely on the federal government for funding. Since the Department of Homeland Security, they've centralized a lot of the major city police departments, all have a liaison in the Department of Homeland Security. So they have already centralized power right in the office of the president and the DHS and what have you. So they have many, many instruments at their disposal to execute this policy. All that's left now is an order from the Oval Office. And once he gets in there, if the order goes out to remove these people, you have every reason to believe that it will be carried out.
But hold up, okay? If we take his numbers, 11 million or so, it costs about $10,000 or so per person to deport. Right. So we're talking about $40 billion. Now, you think the Congress is going to allow him to go carte blanche and do this? But also, even though they may be so-called illegal or undocumented, they still have due process under this country. We still live in a constitutional democracy. So can he just run roughshod over all of these realities and implement something like that?
The law is on his side to implement this. Remember, we've already passed these draconian laws that empowered Bush. Obama has kept most of them. They're still there. They will now be in the hands of President Trump. So most of it is going to he's going to be able to implement it relatively unchecked by Congress or anything like that. There may be a little bit of slow up here and there. Activist groups may have some ability to affect. And really what's going to be a substantial force is governors and mayors trying to, resist this. But then again, they need money.
Well, de Blasio and the mayor of LA have already stated that they're going to make their cities safe communities.
Right.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So is that where we're likely to see some resistance to this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially in cities and communities and towns where you do have a lot of diversity, you're going to see mass mobilization and a push for that. And we're already, like you said, we're seeing that in New York here. That's why you have all these young kids out there protesting who are really upset by what happened. And to your point about, that's what I was basically hinting at too. Yes, he may, on the books, on the law, may be able to do this, but it requires a tremendous amount of money. And I don't know if, he can just go in and use that money and there's not going to be a lot of objection even within the GOP establishment itself.
What about the wall? The beautiful wall that everybody's going to build?
He promised to do it. So yeah, we have every reason to believe that he will. Otherwise, that's going to be a major criticism. So,
But David, I mean, you've heard very sophisticated guy. We know that politicians run, well, although he was not a traditional politician, but he ran under his promise. And if he reneged from it, he won't be the first to do so. If it's a bad policy, should he go ahead with it?
The wall policy or fence or however you want to call it is not a Trump policy. It actually has been around before Trump. So there's already been support for this on both sides of the aisle, not in the way that he has been positioning it. I just don't think that this is a promise that he can pull back from. And once again, the law is on his side to implement that kind of policy as well. The money issue is going to be there, but he can get the money. He's got the bully pulpit. He's got other programs that he can siphon the money from. that are already there as line items in the budget, so he can get the money, he can divert it, and he has every reason to believe that, just for sake of his own credibility, that he will. To assume, I think, that he won't is wishful thinking at this point.
Nita?
I would disagree, because I think he can basically change his mind on anything, and his supporters, his base, those staunch supporters will be there no matter what. It's like he said when he was running, I could go out on Fifth Ave and shoot somebody and kill somebody and get away with it, and I think that's very true, because we've seen so much flip-flopping during the campaign, and then even in these few days since then, backtracking on stuff, and I think he can couch it in a way and say that, oh, I've looked at the issues, or I've gotten more information now, so I'm gonna, we're gonna alter this a little bit because I'm a smart, person and I listen to people. And he's gonna, make statements like that, and his supporters will still be there regardless. I think there's a way for him to get out of the wall even.
All right. Okay. We do for our first break. Stay tuned. There's more to come. Thanks for staying tuned to a special look at President-elect Trump and what's ahead for his administration. So, David, another promise that Trump made, he was a brilliant businessman. He knows how to create jobs. And if he's elected president, he is going to create more jobs than there are Americans for. Are we to take him at his word or what?
He has hubris. He has this this desire to deliver, particularly on economic performance. So his plan to the trade policies that he wants to implement, pulling out of some of these trade agreements, which people are now accepting that are essentially dead, that may create some jobs and also retain some jobs. If he's successful also at bringing the capital, major corporate capital that's been offshored, something that's at 2 to 3 trillion, if he's successful in bringing that back through some kind of tax maneuver, that too will stimulate some job growth and some hiring here as well. And then the other thing that he added was the infrastructure plan, the private-public partnership with infrastructure across the country in inner cities to rebuild infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, wastewater systems, and what have you. That too will create a substantial amount of jobs. Whether he will hit the target, I think he said 25 million or something like that. I think over a 10-year period or whatever it was. That remains to be seen. But as far as job creation, if some of these policies get implemented, which some of them have bipartisan support, we'll see some job creation, some stimulus.
Well, so neither in that case, from what David is saying, he's talking more about job creation, and what Trump has been promoting out there is bringing jobs back. The two are very different. Mm-hmm. Now, can he bring any of these jobs back?
Well, yeah, that's a great point. I was going to say trumping. He's been trumping, right? That he's going to bring these jobs back, pun totally intended. Because at the end of the day, we have to remember, and this is something that a lot of people did not talk about during this election, is the way that those jobs, like certain manufacturing jobs and certain, factoring jobs, are just never going to come back because of technology, because of things that have been created since then, that you don't need those jobs anymore. And I don't think it's realistic at all to assume that those quote unquote jobs are going to come back here. And for him, he sold his supporters a bill of goods that are definitely not coming back. This is somebody who has his own steel made overseas, who has his own ties, who has done stuff within his own business acumen or lack thereof, I should say, a lot of times to get stuff done overseas, but act like he's, this person standing here who's going to do this stuff for the average American. And they are two totally different things. Job creation and actually bringing those back are two very, very different things. And I don't think the bringing the jobs back is going to come back, but I hope that there will be some job creation, because there is a lot of pain and a lot of hurt out there that people just ignored for a long time, and that's what he tapped into.
David, are those his supporters and those with whom he connected so viscerally, are they able to really capitalize on this new economy, the new jobs that will be created if they are? Are they well-trained enough to be part of that workforce?
I think she's right that most of the jobs, many of the manufacturing jobs aren't going to come back. However, manufacturing has several processes. The basic manufacturing isn't coming back at all. But some of the finished, so for instance, Toyota has a finished processing plant here. Nissan built one here. So companies that are international do build final processing here. Mm-hmm. So even though most of their manufacturing is abroad, they do final packaging and final processing here, all those can come back. So those are things that can be done here, the American versions of those. So that'll create some jobs, allow him to cut some red tape and clap and say he did something. Then also the some of the newer.
But again, let's just cut to it. Somebody who with a high school degree from a very bad high school, can that person find a job in today's manufacturing world?
I mean, there are some manufacturing-related jobs that will remain. I mean, in his industry, construction.
But even those will remain. It's robotics. It's a lot of it is technology. It's things that highly skilled jobs in manufacturing. It's no longer just going in a factory line and just like stamping this thing and he's just going. It's jobs that require you to have 21st century education.
Yes, in some part, but the construction, the rebuilding the bridges, rebuilding the infrastructure of the country, that is a blue-collar, work-related jobs that I think will create jobs domestically within the major cities and in that industry that has been suffering a little bit. So if there is a construction boom, for instance, because there's government injected money into that's gonna create a lot of jobs for those blue-collar workers who have those skills, welding, plumbing, and what have you. So I think that's going to create some jobs and some opportunities for people in that area, and that will deliver enough to that community to say, hey, look, Trump did this for us, and I think that's what he wants to do in this first term.
I remember I hark back to 8 years ago when Obama was elected, and there was so much hope, and we heard about post-racial America and all that nonsense. 4 years from now, what are we going to be talking about the post-Trump administration?
Honestly, I hope it's not what we've seen over this last week. It's just, there's been a lot of ugliness, a lot of stuff we've seen going on around the country, and I just hope that that's not what we see for the next 4 years. I hope that he can stand up and say, like President Obama was always reminded that he's the president of all America. And that's what Trump really needs to come out and take a very strong stand and say, even to those people who did not vote for me, I want to bring you in, we're all inclusive, we're all going to work together. And he actually needs to implement things and actually talk to these communities, talk to people of color, talk to the Latino community, the Black community, the Muslim community, the Asian community, and make sure that they're not marginalized and they don't feel scared and that they aren't included in society. He really needs to make a strong stance.
So where do we go from there in terms of the opposition, the Democratic Party? Is it able to really mount constructive opposition and really serve as a counterbalance to Trump's presidency?
It's been a difficult time. I think the party is in disarray. The major leaders now are Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and a few other governors, including Governor Cuomo.
Of course, we have Senator Schumer.
Senator Schumer is taking a leadership role as well. So it's going to coalesce around. Now it's like almost a civil war in between the party, between the left wing and the more of the centrist. As it is now, it looks like the weight is on the hands of the left wing now, and they're going to try to take over for the DNC chair. I think Keith Ellison is going to end up being the chair. If he is, then you're seeing the left wing now make their move for power. They want to run a 50-state campaign, not just in the states that are considered blue. They want to run it everywhere. They want to try to push for governorships and state legislatures. They also want to take back the House and the Senate in 2 years.
That's very ambitious. And what's in place to give us an idea that this can happen, Lida?
Well, I think they're finally waking up, especially after this election. So I was at the Jacob Javits Center on election night, and it looked like, honestly, it looked like as the numbers came in and the realization to people that Clinton was not going to win, it looked like you were at a funeral. It really felt like somebody died. And most of those people, if not all of them in that room, just didn't even think this was a reality. So I think this is like a wake-up call, a check for them to get mobilized, to get organized, like you said, around the country, in states everywhere, to take back state legislatures, and then also to be involved and take back the House seats that they lost. And I wrote a piece this week about how Democrats really need to find their backbone, because what they do a lot of times, and what they did even after Obama was elected in '08, they just throw their base under the bus. Like he rode in on this huge wave of young support, right? That diverse coalition, the Obama coalition of young people, the diverse young people that are out there. And millennials are actually the biggest part of the population right now. They're the biggest percentage. And if they had come out in numbers for her like they did for Obama, she would have won. And instead, they basically threw the Bernie Sanders folks under the bus. You know, during the primaries, she just said something to the effect of like, you know, we want all the Bernie supporters, and then they implemented a few things, but between that time and election day, she really didn't do anything to bring them in. And what happened? They sat home. So I think those young folks who are like angry now and they do want to see progress continue in this country, if they tap into that and do tap into their base, then they can actually affect change.
Thank you. Yeah. Stay tuned. When we come back, a few final thoughts from our guest. Welcome back. The day after the election's result, we saw thousands of people across the country, mostly young people, take to the street to protest the elections. Neela, were you surprised by that spontaneous protest?
No, not at all. And, you know, we've seen it's been sustained protests, right? Like it just wasn't that day. Even this past weekend, we saw tens of thousands come out right here in New York City, and you've seen them around the country. I think the first day was over 25 cities, and this is on a daily basis because most of these young people, like I said, a lot of them were Bernie supporters, right? They also wanted change. They didn't want the establishment, and they're much more engaged in the process that people give them credit for. But what happened was that Clinton and the DNC did not tap into them. They forced Clinton upon them, and they basically said, you know, we're not going to go for this either. And they felt they sort of disenfranchised themselves, which I don't necessarily agree with, not voting and participating in the process, but I understand why that happens and why that took place. And that's what happened with these young kids. And they're like, you know what, we're not going to stand for Trump. And I'm hoping that this mass mobilization is going to turn into something constructive. Like we saw the Tea Party in 2010, right? Come in and ride in and take over all those House seats. And I'm hoping that these young kids can do the same thing and mobilize into actually being, you know, active participants.
So, David, we had an election. By all accounts, Donald Trump won fair and square.
Yeah.
So why protest?
I'm not even sure if it's so many Sanders supporters that are. I think, and I also, I'm not even sure how spontaneous these are. The Move On.
Really?
Yeah, MoveOn.org and some groups out there have these what are called social generals that are out there all across the country.
You sound like Trump now. That's what he said. He was like,
they
professional.
They have people who can organize these types of things. They have huge social networks, so they can put out little events, and then people will come and join them. There is some organizational capacity out there. They were doing this during the campaign. They organized a Chicago event. There's been some journalism also that has covered this stuff and gone behind the scenes and actually documented some of this. So this is in full effect now. Some of the people are there just there because they're obviously generally upset with the outcome. But you know, the dissatisfaction I think is largely because some people didn't see this coming because of the way the mainstream media really dropped the ball on this one and actually stopped being a journalistic entity and were more of a propaganda entity, and we're not telling people the possibility that either one of these candidates could prevail.
But that's not true. I mean, frankly, I've watched CNN. In fact, I've seen their political director saying, yeah, there's a path, it's a narrow path, it's difficult by traditional measures. But, you know, I don't think, in fact, the opposite I've heard that Trump was a media
in the primaries, but not in the general election. The general election, the media was, Newsweek printed 125,000 copies of the congratulatory magazine celebrating Hillary Clinton's election. Before the election, they printed these and they shipped them. So the media, this is unprecedented stuff that the media was doing. They were decisively, one-sided in the general election campaign. In the primaries, yes, they were all over the Trump phenomenon, but in the general election, that wasn't the case at all. So people didn't see this coming. If you ask 80% before the election, 80% of the public thought Clinton was going to, or at least 75% thought that Clinton was going to win. So when it became clear that she was not going to win,
when did it become clear she wasn't going to win? Because I thought it was Tuesday night at 10 o'clock.
yeah, that's. I mean, some people saw this. I mean, like I said, you asked me in several episodes ago, what was going to happen, and I was the only one I think who said that Trump had a chance to win.
True. I respect
and for
you
me,
that.
I believe that the election was lost in July, but people didn't see this at all up until some people
didn't,
even right now. There's some people in denial. They're trying to say, oh, maybe she can still win. And there's, I mean, it's because the media has done this.
You're right, and because to his point, you're absolutely right in that sense, where the media did always go to polls, right, to old metrics, and in this election, what we saw more than anything was that the old metrics don't apply, right? So, and Trump was actually, and I hate to use the word brilliant, but he was brilliant in using the media he used the mainstream outlets in the media, he demonized them, but then used them to his own advantage, got billions in free airtime, and as the old adage goes in show business, remember he's a showman, there's no such thing as bad press. So that completely helped him there. But then he used alternative things and social media and technology to reach those people who don't watch the news, to reach those who are disenfranchised and basically fed up with the system and the establishment. And he used both ends of the spectrum to win, to get in. And it was just a master strategy, and it worked for him.
Now, remember during the campaign, we were talking about the Second Amendment being under siege. With Trump's election, is the First Amendment under siege, David?
I don't think he's gonna, try to suppress dissent. I don't see that. Obviously, he's against these protests and what have you. But this is America. I mean, these things. You're gonna have to allow these things to occur and try to reach out to people and what have you. I think that if he actually tries to suppress dissent or it's like putting a balloon underwater and then watching it pop back.
But the rhetoric hasn't been helpful. I mean, in fact, the other day, his former campaign manager, Kellyanne Conway, told Senator Harry Reid, you better be careful of how you criticize. So is that a veiled threat, or maybe not so veiled?
Right.
I mean, are we likely to see that when a reporter writes a critical article about the president? Then what are we supposed to say?
Right. And he said something to that effect, right? That he was going to open up the libel laws, and we're going to be able to sue anybody who writes something or says something we don't like. Which there's no such thing as like a libel law against the media. You can't do that, right? But he made those.
Actually, there is. I mean,
if you're a public
there is.
Well, okay.
If you're a public figure, I think you got to back off.
But go ahead.
But the point being that he is now the president, right? The president-elect, and he's going to be the president of the country, and he's made those kinds of statements and put that out there. And his very first tweet was actually about, after the election, his very first tweet was about the protesters and how, the media was conspiring against him. And then I believe once Kellyanne Conway, I'm sure, and his other folks behind the scenes took control of his Twitter, they kind of toned it down and he had to do a different tweet. But, it's very dangerous to have somebody like this in that power, in that position of power, because we don't know. Let's remember, this is also the same America where we have seen dissent people have been thrown in jail, people have been killed for dissent, so let's not forget that there are periods in our history where we've done very ugly things to people who stood up to power.
David?
I think all presidents have gone after opponents. Whether Obama kicked out Fox for a long time, and to this day, I think refuses to do any expose with Fox. So it's not unprecedented for a president to attack media that is unfavorable to them. And actually, what we've seen from WikiLeaks, we know that the Clinton campaign was actively, recruiting journalists that were favorable to them. They called them friendlies, and then also, trying to control the press in that way. So I think both campaigns are going to try to do that, and I think it's not going to be unprecedented if they try to manipulate the media and also try to deliver some kind of blows to anyone who's negative to them,
right.
Whether reduce their access or what have you.
But it's one thing to not do an interview with Fox, and it's another thing to take away the credentials from the Washington Post, which he did, and then gave them back. Like, are we going to see that, or is he going to be much more measured. I know.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I know it's half hour, but still, there's so much to talk. And hopefully, you guys can come back later on and discuss some more President Trump.
Absolutely.
That's our show this week. Thanks to my guest, freelance reporter Nida Khan, and associate adjunct professor at CUNY, Dr. David Karanga. Till next time, be independent-minded.